part of an integrated and coherent process. And so we're going to look at some of the aspects of dialogue and how resolution dialogue plays into that type of coherent, holistic approach. So what is it? What is resolution dialogue? Well, the first thing I want to say is in response to Calton's question is can you dialogue with a faceless organization? And I think that it's been answered really quite nicely, but I'll succinctly put it in a way that we are aware that that the perpetrators of violence are not necessarily acting independently. They are influenced by others who have interests in Cabo Delgado, whether that be in dominating certain territories for certain reasons, particularly from an illicit trade perspective, for example. We also are aware that there is financing that comes from internally. So in other words, that the perpetrators of violence are rewarded for some of the acts that they carry out, particularly when they're dominating specific areas of territory. And therefore we are aware that there are people and groups that can influence the perpetrators of violence. And those are the individuals, those are some of the groupings of people that actually we'd focus dialogue on. And that's dialogue, therefore, is aimed at increasing understanding. We've made that point very, very clear. Mutual understanding of the problem is critical. That's the first step towards addressing it. But also it's all about a lot of listening, and there's a lot of suspension of judgment needs to go on in dialogue. So people have to come prepared to a dialogue with a willingness to listen to what other people have to say and then form a common understanding. And that is really critical in this process, and come with a curious mindset. Now, resolution dialogue particularly focuses on one area, and that is really trying to establish common interests. And you'll hear me talk about interests quite a bit. And interest-based mediation or interest-based negotiation is all about getting to the root of stakeholder interests and trying to align those interests so that actually we can move forward in resolving interests. So rather than positions, we talk about interests. Positions often cause an awful lot of deadlock in negotiations because people sit hard and fast on a certain position, when actually if you can get to what their real true interests are, then you find it's a lot easier to start aligning them between different stakeholders. So resolution dialogue as a tool for peace. A lot of resolution dialogue has been attempted throughout Africa, and not all of it has been 100% successful. But when you've got to measure this as part of, as I said, a coherent process, and one that involves obviously security aspects. The one thing for sure is that dialogue in addressing problems for the longer term is far more effective than short-term military operations. And that is a critical point. And so whereas military operations have their role in a wider resolution process, actually it's dialogue in the longer term will have a longer term impact. I think one of the most interesting dialogues that's just taken place recently in Africa was the Sudanese Dialogue, interestingly enough facilitated by South Sudan, but involving at least 8 or 9 different stakeholders, a process that was about, again, understanding what stakeholder interests were and trying to align those interests, given that there was a new dispensation within the government of Sudan and an opportunity to seize the moment and be able to find some resolution, particularly with all of the multiple armed groups that were still operating in Sudan. So drivers, we've talked about drivers and we've talked about the need for nuanced understanding. 2 key drivers for an awful lot of what we're seeing, I think, within Cabo Delgado is greed, the need to dominate aspects of territory, and have strong influence over how, if you like, economic interests are progressed. And that secondly is grievances. And we see an awful lot of grievances in Cabo Delgado, particularly at a local level, between various different community groups. And between greed and grievances, they are usually the two key elements that drive conflict. And so therefore, satisfying these multiple interests, where we do have significant economic interests, be they legal or illegal, but at the same time, we have socioeconomic grievances that need to be satisfied as well. And aligning those aspects up is really critical. And hence the need for a coherent, collaborative, inclusive process. And lastly, one that's voluntary. And there's no point in having dialogue unless you can get people to the table from a voluntary perspective. We'll say that ultimately dialogue can only be successful if you can build confidence and trust between the stakeholders. This is an underpinning element. And that doesn't begin straight away. And that's why dialogue can be a long process about building confidence, about building trust, about understanding each other's interests, about sharing issues, sharing dialogue, and coming together to be able to, as I said, to align interests and have a better appreciation of everybody's challenges. So trust is very important, and the mediation obviously has a key role in enabling that process in terms of building trust between different stakeholders. Another term that we use is mutually hurting stalemate. And it's questionable whether there is mutually hurting stalemate within Cabo Delgado. I'd suggest that there probably is, because nobody is winning out of this process at the minute, out of this conflict. Nobody is winning. There is no potential for, I think, for any particular stakeholder to be victorious. It will be just attritional. It will be kept within boundaries, as we've said, certainly within 9 districts currently in Cabo Delgado. And everybody, regardless whether you're a violent extremist or whether you're a private sector actor, is suffering at the minute. And perhaps the most important thing is that the local communities are suffering more than anybody else, and as a result of this violence. So mutually hurting stalemate, where all stakeholders are suffering to some degree, is the ideal opportunity to start a resolution dialogue. I'll very quickly run through what I say are 4 key stages of resolution dialogue. How does it work? First stage is critical, and that is establishing a safe environment, an environment where people are willing to talk, we're willing to share experiences, willing to have discussions openly. And often that environment has to be private. It's not a public setting. And people have to feel safe and confident that they can open up in that environment, and that their interests will be looked after. And secondly, before dialogue really begins, there has to be a common basis. Everybody has to understand the purpose and structure of the process, and all stakeholders need to appreciate that. And often that takes place as part of a process of consultations prior to dialogue. And so in the Cabo Delgado context, it would be now that is really critical, particularly as SADC continue to engage with their needs assessment. It's understanding who the key stakeholders are, how to bring in the relevant support regionally and maybe even internationally, but actually more importantly, who are the local stakeholders to engage with, consulting with them, and ensuring that there is a consensus among stakeholders to how this process might take place. Secondly, you've heard this many, many times from all the speakers today, which is great, and that is the idea of developing a common base of knowledge. When in a dialogue process, I've said this before, it's suspending judgment is really important. Being able to listen is a really important skill. And this is where we explore stakeholder beliefs, perceptions, and narratives. And the whole idea is to try and synthesize all of these approaches and develop a common base of knowledge. This is where relationship building is key, and this is where the mediation should come in to really help facilitate building relationships as stakeholders share experiences and share their understanding of the situation. And ultimately, by building up this rapport, that a common understanding between stakeholders can be built. Not everybody's going to agree all the time, but it's having that common basis which to build on. The third phase is potentially, or third stage is potentially the most important, where actually once a common understanding is developed, once there is some trust amongst stakeholders, and there is some confidence to share ideas, this is where the key conflict-related issues are discussed. And this is once again where getting into the detail of what stakeholder interests are, what are the interests of the key stakeholders, and as they're discussed, it's more likely that they will naturally align amongst a group of stakeholders that have built trust and confidence with each other. And again, the mediation has a key role in this at this point in time, because often this is where you find deadlock in discussions, and the mediation's role there is to table concepts and different ideas to prompt more discussion, to prompt more dialogue between the stakeholders, and again, to put ideas on the table that may be options that the stakeholders can see as may satisfy their interests going forward. And finally, the most important aspect is if you can have successful dialogue where there is a number of agreements, but it's actually perpetuating that communication between stakeholders so that joint decisions can be made. And actually, the communication then takes place naturally between stakeholders. It doesn't have to be facilitated. So naturally, dialogue takes place, interests are aligned, and individual stakeholders or groups of stakeholders actually begin to communicate with each other to resolve sort of key issues. And that's when you actually acknowledge that there's some success within the dialogue process. So I'm going to finish now with those 4 points. I will finish off by saying that this, you may have seen that CDD are releasing a series of briefings which look at different aspects of conflict resolution. If you're not on the mailing list, then I suggest you get on it, because there is Resolving Conflict in Cabo Delgado and Resolution Dialogue. The next one will come out next week, which will look at the role of amnesty and alternative livelihoods. And then we're also going to do a piece looking at preventing violent extremism and how to introduce that element into dialogue. So please look out for those. But thank you very much for the opportunity, Adriano, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Richard Renz, muito obrigado. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard, for that brilliant presentation. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard. So the dialogue is possible. Carlton Cadeado, meu amigo, 1 minute.
Professor, muito obrigado mais uma vez. Está de parabéns por organizar este debate. Eu apreciei bastante a última intervenção do professor Richard e fez-me lembrar muitas coisas que nós discutimos na sala de aulas e que teoricamente estão muito bem organizadas. Também estendo os meus parabéns para o professor Richard. Mas eu continuo ainda com as minhas dúvidas. Por que eu tenho as minhas dúvidas, professor Adriano? É que nas experiências de negociação aqui neste país, sempre ficou claro que é preciso ir ao centro daqueles que realmente contam quando nós estamos a falar de negociação, não é? Geralmente, quando nós falamos de negociação, é preciso ir ao coração daqueles que realmente contam, mandam e decidem numa negociação, não é? Agora, quando o professor Yusuf Adami intervém, ele coloca outros stakeholders. Esses outros stakeholders, de facto, são importantes, mas eles não têm o poder decisório para poder influenciar numa negociação. Eu termino com um exemplo que aconteceu durante a luta de libertação nacional aqui em Moçambique. A Frelimo sempre disse que era preciso ir ao coração daqueles que realmente mandam no sistema português para falar com eles. Sem chegar a eles, qualquer outro negociador à volta seria um mero exercício de entretenimento e que ia condenar qualquer tentativa de diálogo ao fracasso. É por isso que eu estou a insistir na necessidade de nós sabermos quem de facto manda, quem dá a cara, quem são os líderes deste grupo. Sem isso, vamos ficar no entretenimento, mas não quero desvalorizar a importância dos outros stakeholders. E muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Dr. Carlton Cadeado, por estas rápidas reações. O início deste processo é mesmo assim. E esta plataforma visa mesmo promover este diálogo.
Professor, não consigo lhe ouvir.
A este nível. E como diz o professor Yusuf Adam, a necessidade de trazermos para aqui as comunidades, os líderes comunitários ao nível mais pequeno, que são esses que convivem com as pessoas. Ontem, o Presidente da República, Sua Excelência Filipe Jacinto Nyusi, disse na conferência de óleo e gás que vai devolver a paz para Cabo Delgado. E nós pensamos que este evento se encaixa bastante bem neste comprometimento do chefe de Estado em encontrar paz, para que possamos desenvolver Moçambique com todos, de forma inclusiva. Professor Yusuf Adam, meio minuto, antes de passarmos para o meu amigo Khalid. Professor Yusuf Adam. Foi tomar café, professor Yusuf Adam. Quando voltar, passamos para a última apresentação do Khalid Kozer, Dr. Khalid. Ele é do Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, do GSERF. Nosso parceiro, importante ator nas iniciativas sobre preventing and countering violent extremism. Bastante importante o trabalho que o GSERF faz. Muito obrigado, nosso parceiro, Dr. Khalid Kozer. Por favor, a sua apresentação. Clear and loud.
To protect individuals, reintegrate returnees, and build community resilience against radicalization and recruitment. Just turn off over the past 3 years, we've invested over $100 million in communities across the world, including many in sub-Saharan Africa. Our grants have reached 2 million people at direct risk and a further 10 million people in the communities around them. We provide better alternatives to violent extremism by investing in improving cohesion within communities, strengthening the relationship between government and communities, providing people access to livelihoods and skills, and developing their personal sense of purpose and self-worth. Our multilateral governing board has equal representation the donor countries, partner countries, the private sector, and civil society. We are funded by and help coordinate security, development, and humanitarian donors. At the national level, country ownership is a guiding principle, and we work closely with national governments to promote their own security and development policies. We partner in countries with the United Nations and other international organizations. We try to convert political cooperation at the international level into practical results at the local level. In some countries, GCEF works directly in regions where violent extremism is already a critical threat. In others, we work in surrounding regions to help contain and stop the spread of violent extremism and its negative impacts. You kindly invited me today to say a few words, provide a brief introduction to preventing and countering violent extremism. I'm not an expert on Mozambique, and so I propose to provide insights from other contexts, and I look forward to learning from you how these may or may not be relevant for Mozambique. Let me say already that GCEF is currently discussing with the government of Mozambique opportunities to partner together. On preventing and countering violent extremism, there is still considerable debate about terminology, and I don't really want to get into that debate here. For the sake of simplicity, let me simply refer to preventing violent extremism, PVE. And I'd like to very briefly introduce PVE by explaining first what it is, secondly, what it is not, and thirdly, how to do it. So firstly, what is PVE, preventing violent extremism? I suggest it has three key characteristics. One, it focuses on drivers. These are the reasons why people may become radicalized or recruited to violent extremism in the first place. Our experience suggests that these reasons may include poverty, marginalization, frustration, resentment, and we've heard about grievances as well. Two, PVE focuses on people at risk, but also people who can influence them. For example, teachers, religious leaders, and community change agents. And three, PVE focuses on sustainable alternatives to violent extremism, such as education, employment, and empowerment. Secondly, what is PVE not? First, it is not an alternative to security responses to violent extremism. It is a complement. We know that security responses can have unintended consequences and can risk alienating people. PVE is a way to build a social contract with communities. Second, it does not elevate civil society above local and national authorities, nor does it undermine state authority. PVE is a way to build relationships between communities and authorities and to strengthen the credibility of institutions and the implementation of national policies. And thirdly, and I think importantly, it is not expensive. The return on investment for modest investments in people is far greater and far longer lasting than the return on investment on massive investments in security. Thirdly, how best to do PVE. One, effective PVE promotes national ownership. It is led by governments and is integral to the success of national strategies and policies to address violence and extremism. Two, effective PVE, as we've heard, is sensitive to the local context. There is no one-size-fits-all for a PVE approach, but there are some common denominators, such as respecting gender and diversity. And three, effective PVE involves local communities from the outset, from designing through delivering to assessing projects. Let me conclude by reiterating that GCEF looks forward to working with partners on this call and with the government of Mozambique, working in partnership to do the following: to provide better alternatives to people at risk, thus depleting violent extremist groups of new recruits; to turn the vicious cycle of violent extremism, where despair breeds the resentment upon which violent extremists prey, into a virtuous cycle, where communities are resilient and can prosper; to replace the negative consequences of violent extremism, including the drain on public resources, into positive outcomes, such as greater investment, including from the private sector; to reinforce a new approach to addressing violent extremism, that combines security and development resources and builds meaningful partnerships. And finally, to elevate ambition beyond the immediate crisis towards conceiving a future generation in Mozambique without extremism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid Kozar, for those remarks. It is not expensive to prevent violent extremism, and it pays. Peace, sustainability, and it enables development to reach everyone, including the poor. Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid, for those comments. We have made the first round of interventions. I will go back to all of you with the very same order, giving 2.5 minutes to each of you to make final comments. What we have on table is, number one, the president yesterday said he's committed to finding solutions for peace for Cabo Delgado. He's committed for solutions for peace. This commitment was made at the private sector conference yesterday on oil and gas. This is important. Second, we have SADC. SADC is in town. Their technical deployment is in town. And they are listening to stakeholders. They want to understand the situation, how best can SADC help. We have the statements by Colonel Saranga, where he said 3 things. Number one, the need for the army to protect Mozambique's sovereignty and Mozambique's resources. Second, dialogue is important. Not only military approach can lead to the solution, but he said it is difficult to engage a faceless violent group. Some colleagues, including Dr. Kadeadu, say he has doubts whether a fruitful dialogue can be organized with faceless insurgents. Professor Yusuf Adam, he said, he seems not to be there. He said something. He's a historian, so he speaks in a way that sometimes you need to know him to understand. What he's saying is the following: that dialogue, it's also about understanding governance failures and addressing those problems in a constructive and inclusive way. And in so doing, strengthening the relationship and improving the relationship and trust between, in the platform of governance, between government and local communities, including IDPs. This is the message that was conveying, and I think this is a key message. The need to understand this dialogue, these insurgents. One thing which is important here, that was said by Ambassador Royland and also by Piers and Liesel, is, well, one thing is to have oil or to have diamonds that you can quickly take and go to the markets. The other thing is to have gas. It's a longer term billion-dollar investment, which brings, which has next to it low-hanging fruits. And some of the low-hanging fruits can be captured by those who are in the position, are in the privileged position. And if this is happening, it can create problems. So the mechanism, not only to say the revenues will be shared, but start from the low-hanging fruits, allowing marginalized groups, local communities, also to be part of sharing these low-hanging fruits. And that is the best policy signal that the future revenues will be shared. So I would like to go back to each and one of you and say final 3-minute comments on that. And Richard has taken us through the all possibilities of dialogue. And again, emphasizing what Professor Yusuf Adam had said, that it is possible to engage in a constructive dialogue. And that is urgent. It's urgent. And that must be an inclusive, participatory, inclusive dialogue, including the IDPs. Including the IDPs. So it's not only about a plate of food for IDPs. It's also about them participating in the governance of their situation. Let us talk to the IDPs, not only give them food. Ambassador. Alguma bateria está acabando.
For peace is a first step. In the Netherlands, we are at the moment in a huge political crisis because of a lack of confidence in the government. So it is something that happens all over the world. Many of these problems, of course, are not specific to Mozambique, to Southern Africa. They are global. But political will is a first important thing. And Prof, you are engaging the cabinet, you are engaging the political system and the leadership. That's a very important practical thing. Secondly, SADC, yes. As I said in the previous meeting, I've been with SADC since 1980 when I was a member of the Lesotho delegation. Certainly politically important, certainly essential in the region. Whether Southbridge will be able to mobilize, I think, is a big and open question. So militarily, absolutely limitations, but certainly important to involve the neighboring states, notably, of course, Tanzania, certainly also Zimbabwe and South Africa. So SADC might contribute to an analysis, but it will also bring together the different countries. And then what the colonel said, yes, of course, the government has the obligation to protect. The question is how this is be done, how this is done, how this is linked to dialogue and other issues. The second point that the colonel made, dialogue, again, I think it cannot be underestimated how important it is that both from the President's office and the Ministry of Defense, this call for dialogue is brought up. And then, of course, the big desafio enorme, the real challenge to dialogue with faceless violent groups, because that will have to be done. And I think, my time is over, but what Khalid and Richard pointed at is there are very systematic approaches. They will not lead automatically to success, but they can be used to organize the principle of dialogue. And then finally, my question, of course, is it possible for a number of Mozambican NGOs to contribute to the organization of such a dialogue, to bring together the groups? I've seen myself in the Eastern Congo, and Richard has seen the same, how difficult it is to bring faceless violent groups around the table, but it has to be done, and ways and means have to be found. And I think there, the national Mozambican capacity, I repeat it, is extremely important at a practical level, backed up by solid theoretical and possibly diplomatic support from elsewhere. Let me stop here.
Embaixador Roland, por essas considerações, muito obrigado. Passo agora a palavra ao nosso colega e amigo who speaks now. I will invite now Piers. Piers, your final comments.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to pick up quickly on what Ambassador van der Geer was saying about political will. I think and this also relates to obviously the question that was asked by Carlton Kadaida, which I think is an important one in terms of understanding the power matrix in any situation. Clearly, processes such as these need political champions, and it is important to understand the political power matrix in any one situation and the importance of shifting the calculus of those key power actors and how best to do it. You know, I think one thing sometimes external NGOs don't understand is, with all the best will in the world, their advocacy work isn't necessarily a direct line. They have to talk to other constituencies, and those constituencies must be articulating those issues that the power structure will listen to. So I think one needs to think about strategy and tactics about building that political will. And I think also it's important with respect to dialogue processes to understand what the risk elements are and also to put it in place. And I'm sure Richard and Khalid have got a lot of experience and insights into this. How do you deal with spoilers? How do you deal with accountability in these processes? These are not easy, and there are no easy answers to them. I'm going to leave it there and say thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Muito obrigado. Liesl.
Thank you.
Final comments.
Thank you very much, Adriano and everybody, for a very interesting debate. I think my last contribution would be force and multilateral interventions have not worked across the African continent. And that is, that is why we need to learn lessons from elsewhere. In the Sahel, since the invasion of Mali in 2012 and 2013, international United Nations, French troops against the jihadists in the Sahel, against Boko Haram, against Al-Shabaab in Somalia, those military interventions have not worked, and in some cases the violence has increased. So we have no choice really to look at alternative solutions. So in 2018, when one of my colleagues, Dr. Alorjo Akinola, wrote a piece saying, should we not consider dialoguing with Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab? And you'll find the policy brief on the ISS website. There was outcry. Some people said, that is impossible. How can that be? We can't dialogue with people who were responsible for such atrocities. But the bottom line is we have to think of alternative solutions. And for that, and we have all the experts here, and it was really very interesting listening to you on PVE, and as you said, there's a lot of people with a lot of experience. But what we have learned from, I think, the ISS approaches and so on, is that there has to be access to civil society researchers from the country and from elsewhere to be able to, for example, we've done a lot on Boko Haram, for example, asking communities, do they agree with dialogue with the violent groups? But to do those studies, it takes a lot of time and many years, but we actually, instead of waiting 10 years like we've done in other parts of Africa, we can learn that experience and say, okay, there is an urgent security crisis, SADC is available. And the reason why I was so adamant about SADC is to say, in the Sahel, there was foreign military intervention. Now we're going back to the neighbors and say, okay, we're creating the G5 Sahel because local solutions. So we have to look at SADC because this is a regional problem. But any military intervention should first look at doing no harm, no human rights abuses, and looking at alternative solutions, because we have no choice, and we've seen it on the continent. So thank you so much for inviting me and the ISS, and I really hope a lot of success to all your efforts. Thank you.
Obrigado, Liesl. Muito obrigado. Stephen, your final comments. Stephen, 2 minutes, your final comments.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to say thank you again to Prof. Nwonga and CTD and the rest of the team, my co-panelists today. Perhaps just as a final thought, just to add emphasis to, I think, the importance of keeping channels for dialogue open and creating channels is really of paramount importance. As I think we've seen on other contexts on the continent, that the longer an insurgency is grinds on, the more transnational it gets. You know, there's intergenerational consequences, and the deeper it becomes and harder it is to resolve. So I think perhaps at this stage in the conflict in Cabo Delgado, where there doesn't seem to be a single charismatic leader to Al-Sunnah, where perhaps they haven't consolidated to a large degree, there's some interesting opportunities for dialogue. But I think we need to consider the wider conflict system, and as Liesl and Piers also mentioned, by respecting human rights, by lowering the level of grievances, I think in the region just improves opportunity for dialogue to work in the long term. Because at the moment, you know, the level of violence makes, I think, it prospects for dialogue difficult. But yeah, I'll leave it there and just thank the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Richard, final comments.
Thank you, Adriano. Yeah, absolutely. A couple of quick comments. I'd really support what Liesl just said, and that is the aspect of any type of security intervention, whether it be military nature or otherwise, must seek to do no harm. It cannot make the situation worse. And unfortunately, we have too many examples of that in the continent and elsewhere in the world, where incorrect or inappropriately applied military operations have actually served to escalate conflict. But I'll also mention one other thing, and that is back to stage 2 of the process of dialogue, and that's about developing this common base of knowledge. I've heard a lot today about people referring to an insurgency, and the fact that we've all become very much rooted in the fact that this is actually what we're seeing is an insurgency. And we all know that there are multiple definitions for insurgency, but one of the main definitions would lead you to believe that there is some actual political motive in this violence. And yet we really don't see any evidence of that. But we've all become rooted in insurgency. So part of the process of developing common base of knowledge is to kind of suspend some of that judgment and think about other hypotheses. Certain other hypotheses that are on the table are, think of this in a different context, more like we've maybe seen in Central South America, like the idea of competing cartels, where basically alliances of convenience are developed between violent extremists, between criminals, etc. And they're influenced by a number of masters, a number of financiers, and therefore it becomes a very, very complex environment without one true political or in fact financial or social sort of motive. And then if you look at it in that context, then you can seek to see how the dialogue may have a lot of benefits rather than just purely taking it from a sort of the basis of insurgency. So the point being is, suspend judgment, gather the knowledge, gather the information, look at the hypotheses, see where the weight of the hypothesis lays, and then look to seek dialogue around there. And perhaps let's not get rooted into some of these phrases like insurgency. Thank you.
Richard Rentz, meu amigo, muito obrigado por essas considerações. Passo agora a convidar o Dr. Khalid, comentários finais do GSERF, nosso parceiro.
Well, thank you very much. And let me also thank the organisers and the other panellists. The challenge of going last on a panel that largely agrees with each other is that there's not much to add to what we've heard. But let me just say this, really as a way of summarising what I think I've heard over the last hour or so. It does seem to me that the conclusion around this table is that this is the right time to act. We've heard that there is clear political will within the government in Mozambique. We've heard that there is a regional interest in getting this right for both security and development and political reasons. We've heard that there is an opportunity with a very strong civil society base within Mozambique. We know that there's a private sector stake in all of this, and that should be an opportunity if managed effectively. We've heard from around the table that we do have experience and lessons that we can learn and apply from elsewhere, both in Africa and globally. Let's make sure we mobilize those lessons to make sure we do this correctly and in an appropriate way. And I think finally, at last, we have, I think, clear acknowledgement around this table and more globally that traditional responses to violent extremism simply don't work. And I think there's an appetite for new integrated, coordinated responses. So I think for all of those reasons, there's a real opportunity for us to work together with the government, with other partners, to intervene now to make a lasting difference. And I again welcome the opportunity to work with all of you to realize that ambition. Thank you.
Passo agora a convidar o meu colega Anthony Bonucci para fazer os comentários finais e depois fechamos a nossa sessão. Anton.
Professor, thank you very much, and everyone who has joined us this evening for this very important conversation. The message is very clear, that dialogue is the response of the strong and of the wise. Society and business do not thrive when we falsely fall for the temptation of believing that quick, empty solutions can provide any societal stability. So I thank you all for joining us today. And this is, I hope, a start of a deeper conversation on the subject. Thank you, Professor, and please stay tuned to what CDD produces in the next weeks. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Anton. Muito obrigado a todos. Como Anton disse, este é o início de um processo que vamos desencadear com enfoque em Cabo Delgado, com enfoque nas comunidades em Cabo Delgado. Este é mesmo um webinar para dar início a esse processo. Podem nos contactar a partir dos contactos que estão aí, porque queremos ser inclusivos neste processo. Queremos ser inclusivos neste diálogo. Queremos envolver a todos e queremos influenciar a todos. Influenciar as narrativas também é importante. E queremos mobilizar os stakeholders, todos, ao nível nacional, internacional, provincial, até ao nível do distrito, para que todos possamos, de uma forma inclusiva, caminhar num diálogo que possa permitir que os low-hanging fruits possam chegar a todos e esta aparente competição das elites possa ser feita num contexto de construção do Estado e da nação em Moçambique. Mais uma vez, muito obrigado a todos, aos nossos parceiros, ao GSERF, ao ISS, ao GGA, Ambassador, ao ICJ, muito obrigado por esta parceria. Richard Renz, Anthony Bonucci, a toda a equipa do CDD, em particular a equipa da nossa televisão que faz essa produção. Muito obrigado, estamos juntos e vamos anunciar os próximos passos. Muito obrigado, estamos juntos.